Okay, let's continue.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Makete, if you go to page 117 of bundle FS 14, you will see that
I'm
you
sorry.
deal there with the
I'm
lapse
sorry,
and
Mr.
cancellation of the
Pretorius.
housing tender.
The volume of the aircon has gone up, so somebody will attend to it. Okay, all right, let's continue.
Are you at page 117?
Did you say 117?
Yes, Chair. You deal there with the lapse and cancellation of the housing tender. In paragraph 75.1, you record that in early 2010, the department, by means of a public tender, invited bids for the construction of houses to be funded by the housing allocation. That tender closed on the 16th of April 2010.
Yes.
The Department Supply Chain Management Directorate and the Bid Evaluation Committee dealt with it and prepared a report for the Bid Adjudication Committee. That's as you record in paragraph 75.2. You see that?
Yes.
Then in paragraph 75.3, you record, and this is important for future adjudication, that 361 bids were received. 105 were disqualified for basic bid compliance, for example, no valid tax clearance certificate. 147 were disqualified because they did not meet the minimum functionality threshold. Do you know what is meant by the minimum functionality threshold?
Yeah, the minimum score to bid on the next level of price.
Basically, in terms of the scoring, they couldn't do the work.
Yes.
Right? And 28 bids from so-called established contractors and 81 bids from so-called emerging contractors. The Bid Evaluation Committee then recommended that only 109 qualifying bids be adjudicated on price. Then in 75.4, you record that on the 28th July 2010, the Bid Adjudication Committee met to consider the tender. Do you know why they delayed for so long?
Well, I don't know.
You don't know.
Honestly,
Right,
don't
that's
know.
fair enough. But at that meeting, the bid adjudication members acknowledged that the tender validity period had lapsed. And then the BAC did
I'm
something.
sorry, Mr. Pretorius. The tender validity period, what does that refer to? What period is that?
Ordinarily, it will refer to the validity of the tendered price, because if that period passes, then you have to go back to the bidder to see are they still on the same price. In other words,
Does that mean when a bidder submits their bid, they would say, we'll do this job for this price,
correct?
but this price is valid only up to a certain date?
Yes.
Is that what you're talking about?
Normally 60 to 90 days.
60 to 90
90
days.
days. It would,
And that period is fixed by the bidder individually, or is it fixed by the department?
it's prescribed to say that will be the validity period. In an event that it goes beyond that, you will then have to go back to the bidders and say, are you still on that price?
Yes, so it's prescribed in terms of the regulations,
Yes.
in terms of the National Treasury regulations.
Yes.
So when you invite bids, the invitation to bid would include something that says the period will be X.
X, yes.
Is that right?
Yes. It's
So
just-
when you refer to the tender validity period having lapsed, that's the period you're talking
Yes.
about?
And,
Okay.
and hence the earlier statement by Mr. Pretorius to say you could, the regularization means you ask the tenderers
Yeah.
to say, are you still on that price?
And if they say yes, you continue?
You continue, yeah, and then you
Yes.
can continue.
Okay, all right.
Yes. Thank you. We'll get there. Ms. McKetzie, the decision, however, that the BAC made was to say, well, we must cancel the tender and we must take all those who qualified and all those who were disqualified and include them in a database of service providers. Is that, as you understand, the decision that was made?
Yes, in terms of the documents that NM, yes.
That was the decision that is recorded in the following paragraph 75.5. But what is interesting is the minute of that meeting, which reads, the chairperson indicated to the committee that the tender has been evaluated, but due to the fact that the validity of the tender has expired and they cannot adjudicate, they have to cancel the tender. But as you've pointed out, that's not correct. There's no obligation to cancel the tender. You can take steps to regularize.
Yeah, it's you can, it depends. You can cancel, you can decide to ask whether they will still be,
Well,
It's really a choice that you'll have to make.
you can cancel, but then the obligation to have a proper procurement process still remains.
Yes.
So you can't cancel for the reasons that they gave. Is that right?
No, you can cancel because it has expired, but also because the validity period has expired. You can do that.
Yes, but what I'm
Yeah.
saying is they cancelled because of certain reasons, as I understand it. They still wanted to use the money, from what I read here, to still use the money. They say appropriately, spend the money appropriately. Could you spend the money appropriately without a tender on a matter that required a tender?
Yeah, the best way that they could, given that everything was okay, the only issue was the validity period. It's simply to communicate with the bidders and say, are you still on that price? And if they are still on that price, you continue with the evaluation and the award, etc.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, well, we've done a little investigation ourselves into the matter, Ms. McKee. The first point is that the only option was not to cancel the tender. They had other options. We're agreed on that. Yes. You have to say...
Was that a yes,
Yes,
Mr.
okay.
Mkhwezi?
Sorry, yes.
Yeah.
In the first place, they might have taken the trouble to complete the process timeously and without delay. That was the first option. We know that didn't happen. The second option is that before the expiry of the tender period, they could have extended it unilaterally. Before its expiry, they could have extended it unilaterally.
Is that correct, Mr. Mkhwezi?
No, remember the issue, particularly the price issue. To be fair to the tenderers, you must actually indicate to them, because you can only hold a price for so long. The fixed price, taking into considerations that because we are dealing with construction here, prices are not statics. They are rising. So to be fair to them, you must indicate to them, are you still on those particular price? Yes or no?
So you can do
That's
that.
the practice. You know, whether you can do that unilaterally,
Yeah,
you know,
you might not be sure about that.
I might not be sure about that, but
In practice.
you know, in other instances, issues have been taken where you are doing that. You have to inform the tenderers to say, are you still on that particular price? Because that price, ordinarily, it will be valid for a period.
Okay. Mr. Pretorius.
Yes, we'll give chapter and verse to the DC, to the chair in due course. But you're quite correct that there's another step that must be followed. Before the expiry of their period, the department could have initiated a process to extend the period. It would then have required some communication with the tenderers that would either say, extend your bid at the same price or bid again.
Yes, depending on what is the outcome of that. Because I would imagine, even on the tender documents themselves, that period will have been specified.
Yes,
So it's only fair to go back to them to say, we have extended, are you still on that price? Yes or no?
So a bidder could have said, look, you're extending it, but I'm withdrawing my bid. Right? Or it could have said, I'm agreeing to the extension, my bid remains the same. If this happens, this should happen before the period expires. But even after the period expires, you could, for example, cancel the old process and start a new process.
Yeah, you could cancel. You could cancel and start the new process. But also, again, you also have to indicate that you have cancelled.
Well, you could say to the bidders, and that's one of the options that's allowed, you could say to the bidders, listen, the period has expired. We want to continue with the process. Will you maintain your price?
Yes.
Or do you want to give us a new price?
Yes.
So that's also, option is also there. But what you can't do, Mr. McKenzie, where you are required to have an open tender process, is just forget about the process and establish your own database at your own discretion. You can't do that.
No, you can't.
Yes. Okay. Anyway, so that decision was approved according to your statement or your affidavit at paragraph 75.7. That decision to cancel the tender and to establish a database in the discretion of the department was approved on the 30th of July 2010 by Mr. Mokoena, and we'll ask him about that. You see that in paragraph 75.7.
Oh, 7, okay. Yes.
So, when you were looking at this whole thing, Mr. Mukhetsi, did it appear like the bid adjudication committee said, look, the tender validity period has expired, but we do need to do what we were going to do through a tender period, so we'll just do it in a different way. We will put everybody on the database, and then we'll choose who will be given the job. Is that the impression you got when you were going through this whole thing to understand what was happening?
Yeah, but you can't do that because certain of the bidders were disqualified anyway.
Yes, no, that's a different point. I'm just asking your own understanding as you were looking at this whole thing before preparing the affidavit. Is that the impression you got, that this bid adjudication committee said, look, the tender validity period has expired. We wanted to achieve a certain objective through the tender process. We can't do that now, or we are not going to do that now, but we will do what we were going to do through another process, namely put everybody into the database, and then we will choose who will get the job from
No,
that.
but that's not the choice, irrespective of what the circumstances are. You have to follow a part. You can't decide your own process.
Yes, no, but listen to my question.
Okay.
Okay, my question is looking at what your own understanding was as to what this bid adjudication committee sought to do when they found that the tender validity period had lapsed.
Yes.
Was your impression that they decided that the way to achieve what they wanted to achieve through a tender process was to put everybody into the database and then choose the people who would get the job from the database?
It seems like
Yes.
from the
affidavit.
facts and the affidavit, it
Yeah.
seems that that was the
Yes, the approach.
The approach.
Yeah, okay, all right.
Well, then let's just summarize that, Ms. Makesi, and I understand that that is what you are saying. In the first place, the department must appoint contractors through an open tender process. That's obligatory.
Yeah.
So when
Yes.
something happens, such as what happened here, the period expired, one must rectify it.
Yes.
But one is still bound to have an open tender process.
Well, assuming that there was an open tender going towards that. Remember, this is about the extension of the validity period. So the process of open tender would have happened because we are simply indicating to the bidders, are you prepared to remain at the same price?
Yes.
Yes or no?
Yes. So if the remedy had been applied, if the process had been remedied through an agreed or imposed extension, whatever it was,
Yes.
then that would have been an open tender process, is what you're saying.
Yes. Yes.
It would have been a continuation.
It will be a
of the
yes. It
open
will be a
tender
continuation.
system. Yes.
Yes. Assuming that everything was done, there was an advertisement and specification, evaluation, and so on. And then at the evaluation point, then there is the validity period expires, and you go back to the very same tenderers and say, right, are you okay with can you hold on that particular price? Yes, and then you continue the adjudication and award.
Yes, because in that case, the remedy would have been put in place, the same process would have been continued to its conclusion, and then there would have been a proper assessment of the bids,
Yes.
proper and fair assessment of all the competing bids, correct?
Yes.
What one can't do, however, is throw the whole process overboard and simply select your own database.
Yes.
And that's what you say here. You say in paragraph 76, the department thus decided to award contracts to contractors on various databases, as well as to the contractors who had bid for the tender, notwithstanding that 105 of the bidders were disqualified for basic bid compliance reasons, and that a further 147 were disqualified because they did not meet the minimum functionality threshold. Those 252 disqualified bidders were simply allowed back into the process. And then some decision was made, and we're not sure how that decision was made. We will inquire in questions as to who would get contracts.
Yes.
Do you know who in particular decided that particular contractors would be appointed?
I don't know.
You concede, however, as the chair has already pointed out earlier this morning, that that process is fraught with danger because people can be appointed for the wrong reasons.
Yeah. Yes. It leaves too much discretion to individual or individual.
Were you able to understand how anybody could do this, Mr. Mose? I just can't understand how anybody could do that. I mean, you know that there are people who there are service providers who have been found to be disqualified to do this kind of job. And during the open tender process that you have now decided to ditch. And then you say now all of you must come back qualified or disqualified. You will, we will see, you are now all eligible to be given the job. I can't understand how anybody could do that.
No, it shouldn't have been like that. So
but were you able to, is there anything any information you got that made you understand how anybody could do that kind of thing?
Unfortunately not, Chair. I don't know why they would in that particular fashion.
I mean, I don't know. I'm just thinking of a situation where you need teachers for a school. People apply. You select. You say, okay, these ones have qualifications. These ones don't have any qualifications, or these are underqualified. Because something has happened about the period within which they had to apply, you say, no, all of you come. Qualified or not qualified, you can be appointed to teach whatever class. I just can't understand how anybody could do that. And maybe there's something that I will still hear that will make me understand, but I just can't understand. I mean, if they said, well, those that were eligible, that qualified, we will take only those, then subject to the legalities, one would say at least they are looking for people who qualified. But to then say we'll bring everybody, whether they were qualified or disqualified, we'll now bring them together, we'll choose, just doesn't seem to make sense at all.
No, it shouldn't have been like that, Chair. I agree.
Yes, Mr. Pretorius, maybe you have worked with this thing for quite some time. You are not shocked like I am.
There's no acceptable explanation, Chair. That's the simple answer. But Chair, the various investigations have produced some examples of contractors who weren't equipped to do the job, having been given contracts to do the job and utterly failed in the execution of the project, or simply walked off site. There's several examples of contractors just deciding, well, they've got the money, they
took the money and left.
Yes. So there are examples of that, and that is why each particular contract and arrangement should be investigated, because there's somewhere there are allegations of links between illegitimately appointed contractors and officials. We'll come to some allegations in that regard in the evidence in due course.
Okay.
And of course, whilst all that was happening, a number of relatively junior employees get disciplined and dismissed, and those who should be held accountable aren't, and that will become clear in due course. So you summarize in paragraph 78, Mr. McKenzie, you say in the second sentence of that paragraph, none of them, and you're talking of the building contracts that were concluded in and around July 2010, none of them was concluded pursuant to any proper procurement process. The department simply gave the contracts to contractors on its databases or to contractors who had submitted bids for the lapsed and cancelled tender. So they were simply handed out. What we don't have in this affidavit is who made the decisions to distribute contracts and on what basis those decisions were made, and thirdly, what the consequences are of that type of decision-making process. But we will come to that in due course in other evidence. And perhaps references will be made to that in the course of time with your evidence. But as far as you're concerned, do you know who selected the contractors who were to be given contracts?
No, I don't know.
Yes, we'll give detail of the example in due course, Chair. A disqualified contractor was indeed appointed, and according to the Nurture NURCHA report, performed miserably. What is important too in paragraph 80.2, and remember we're putting together the whole jigsaw of facts here, Mr. McKenzie, is that in terms of these contracts, it was the contractor's obligation to provide, and I quote, all of the necessary materials, labor, plant and equipment to erect the project.
Yes.
That was the building contract.
That was the building contract.
And then in 80.4, just to give chapter and verse to your earlier evidence, the contractor was entitled to payment of the amount set out in Appendix 1 per milestone and date as set out in Appendix 1, read with Appendix 3. That would be the sort of payment plan that was provided for in the Division of Revenue Act, I presume.
Yes.
Which said before you can pay money to a third party out of this DORA grant, you must have a payment plan or schedule.
Yes, that identify the work that you have to do.
Yes. What must be done and
how
by
many
when.
units, how many foundations, how many this, how many
Yes.
that. Yes.
And then the contractor was required to deliver to the department a claim for payments of all amounts it considers to be due, which shall be verified by the department prior to processing and payment. So there would be a claim, you would say, for 200 foundations of the 500 houses to be built.
Yes.
That claim would be put in after the work is done and after the materials had been supplied, and it would have to be verified on inspection by the department. Am I correct?
Yes.
So in other words, the expenditure of the state is safeguarded by processes,
Yes.
let alone the process of appointment in the first place by fair and open tender. But even the execution is closely governed.
Yes.
None of those provisions were applied to the 600 million in this case. Is that correct?
Yes.
That's correct.
Yes.
Remember, you are talking to me,
Yes.
Mr.
Oh,
Mokgweetsi.
sorry. Yes.
I need to hear what you are saying.
So Appendix 3, which is the project plan and what is required by DORA as the payment schedule, is dealt with in paragraph 81. There must be details of progress, milestones, and financial projections. Do you see that in paragraph 81?
Yes.
So you summarize that in paragraph 83, Mr. McKenzie. You say the basic structure of the agreement is nonetheless clear. The department would make payments to the contractor against completion by the contractor of particular stages or milestones of the works, with the works claimed for to be verified by the department. Is that correct?
Yes.
And
That's
you make
correct.
the point in paragraph 84 that that accords with construction industry practice, and also in paragraph 85, the housing subsidy system. What is the housing subsidy system, if you would just tell the chair, please?
It's a project management system that the sector uses, and it records all the milestones and for housing, and whether it's infrastructure and so on. So that's the housing subsidy system that we are using for all the provinces. In fact, the sector as a whole. The Department of Human Settlements uses that, and the reports on how many or what we have done come out of that system. So that's basically what the system is. It's basically a project management system.
So you again summarize it and you provide some detail in paragraph 85.5 on page 123, Mr. McKenzie. It's also consistent with the evidence you're giving now. You say, I emphasize that achieving a milestone involves construction work. For example, the foundations milestone involves digging the foundations, throwing the appropriate slab, installing the necessary piping for services such as sewage, water, and the like. And then you say, importantly, the materials relating to a particular milestone must be used by being incorporated into the construction work before the milestone is met. The milestone is not met if the materials are standing loose on site. The principle behind this is expressed as the requirement that government achieve value for money before it makes a payment. So there are two things that emerge from that, Mr. McKenzie. I take it that that's a correct summary of the position.
Correct.
The first is that before the contractor has a claim for the first milestone, the foundations, all that work must have been done and verified.
Yes, before.
And the second thing is before the supplier would receive any payment from the contractor, all the materials would have to be in those foundations.
Yes.
And then you make the point in paragraph 85.6, a contractor's work must be checked before the department or other organ of state feeds into the housing subsidy system the information that a particular milestone has been reached and that payment can therefore be made. And that is a complex and controlled process in terms of various regulations and provisions. Is that correct?
Correct, yes.
And then in 85.7 you say a contractor on a government-funded housing project is thus only entitled to an interim payment against his or her having achieved a properly verified milestone. Now that, you say in paragraph 86, accords with National Treasury requirements, DORA requirements, as well as all the building regulations that exist, and including the housing subsidy system.
Yes.
Correct.
Yes.
If we could go back then, please, to paragraph 40. I'll give you a page in a moment.
108.
It's on page 108. Are you there?
Yes.
Paragraph 40 records that the National Department of Human Settlements, as a practice, I presume, monitored what the provinces were spending of their DORA allocations. That was its duty, correct?
Yes.
And in October 2010, 6 months into the financial year, the monitoring exercise indicated that 4 provinces, including the Free State, had not met their monthly spending targets, nor their monthly targets for the delivery of low-cost houses. That was a fact in 2010 in the Free State.
Yes.
Minister Sekwale, who was then the Minister of Human Settlements, raised concerns with the various provincial MECs and issued a notice and said to the Free State and the other provinces, I want to see your expenditure recovery plan, what is referred to in your affidavit later as the ERP. Do you see that?
Yes.
In other words, you were saying, show me how you're going to fix this.
Yeah. Yes.
You make a representation to me as to how this situation of underspending is going to be remedied, otherwise you forfeit.
Yes.
and the money will be differently allocated. Is that light bothering you?
No, not really.
Is it okay?
That's still okay.
So, in paragraph 42, you say, the MEC, you've told us that that was Mr. Zwane, and the department's senior officials met to develop a plan to improve expenditure. And you say in paragraph 42, the expenditure plan which the department developed and which I describe in more detail below projects a very high rate of expenditure over the period November 2010 to the end of March 2011. We'll look at the plan in a moment because the plan itself, as you will probably recall, is quite remarkable for what it says and what it doesn't say, but we'll get there. Paragraph 43, well, let's first deal with one issue. The name is instructive, Expenditure Recovery Plan. Manifestly, the whole object of the plan was to make sure that the money, the 1.4 million, wasn't taken away from the province.
Yes. Yes.
So what the purpose of the plan would have been was to persuade the National Department and Treasury not to take the money away.
Yes, not to take a certain portion of the money, not all of it. And this is measured against the performance to say this is what we are likely going to achieve. And we, as it later turned out, it only 200 million, I think, 263 million.
236 million.
36, sorry.
Well, that depends on what you told them, but we'll come to that. The corollary to that is that if you didn't manage to persuade them, they would have put the money to lawful and, in their minds, better use by giving it to performing provinces.
Yes, that's normally what will happen. That's what happens.
Yes.
Money is reallocated to other provinces that are performing.
And of course, if the department, the National Department and the Treasury is persuaded on false information, they are then prevented from doing their job in terms of the legislation by allocating the money appropriately.
I don't know. The National Department was not convinced about the recovery plan. They took the money anyway.
Right. Well, we'll come to that. What they were told and what they were not told. Right.
Okay.
And whether they, and on basis of what information they finally made their decisions. But let's go to paragraph 43. And what you raise is important because they warned the provincial department about non-compliance. And you say that in your affidavit, not so?
Yes.
Paragraph 43, you say by the time the department developed that plan, that's the Expenditure Recovery Plan, October 2010, it had already started making unlawful payments from its fiscal allocation to some contractors and suppliers. The high rate of expenditure projected in the plan for the period November 2010 to March 2011, those are the remaining months after the plan was developed, was premised on and dependent upon such unlawful payments continuing. Furthermore, by the time the department developed the plan, it knew, because it had been told by the National Department, that such payments were unlawful and must stop. Correct?
Yes, yeah.
So, the unlawful payments were unlawful in several respects, as you pointed out. Firstly, they were made to persuade the National Treasury and Department that money had been properly spent and that all was in order, correct?
Yes.
And furthermore, they were unlawful because there had been no proper procurement process.
Yes, there was no.
And that it was unlawful too because they were advance payments which hadn't been processed in accordance with the requirements of
Correct.
DORA. Correct. In Treasury regulations.
Yes.
Correct, yes. So you say in paragraph 44 that the department knew that the plan was unlawful, yet continued to make the payments. Do I understand your statement correctly here?
Yes.
So you say the payments were unlawful because no contracts were in place with the suppliers, no proper procurement process had been followed, and neither the National Department nor the National Treasury had authorized or indeed even knew about the payments. Those are the advance payments.
Yes.
Correct. So National Treasury wasn't told, look, we've made a whole lot of payments, they're advance payments, and that they're probably unlawful because no procurement process was followed. That information wasn't given to National.
Yes.
It came to learn of the situation through other means, which we will come to in a moment. Paragraph 44.2, Neville Cheney, who was Chief of Operations of the National Department, had learned, and I emphasize the words had learned, that the department was making unlawful payments. Now, as you say, Mr. Maketsi, that information would have been gleaned by you in the disciplinary proceedings that took place after 2010-2011. Am I correct? Do I understand the position correctly?
Yes.
What he said in those proceedings was, no, I wasn't told this, or the National Department wasn't told this by the province. We learnt through our Chief Financial Officer picking up the payments on the housing subsidy scheme ledgers. Is that correct? Is that in accordance with what you
that's how they
report?
will pick it up.
Yes, they picked it up with the very words used. Correct. You recall that?
Yes.
Yes. And he says, or he said, and you record this at the top of page 110, Cheney discussed this with officials from the National Department and the National Treasury. In other words, his discovery or his information that payments were being made. The officials agreed that the department's payments were unlawful. The officials also agreed that had the department, that's the Free State Department, approached the National Department or the National Treasury for permission to make such advance payments, permission would have been refused. In any event, that was Cheney's evidence. For the record, Chair, it's in volume 17, Free State Bundle 17 at page 253 and following. I can go there if you wish.
No, that's fine. Thank you. I've noted.
It seems, at least from Mr. Cheney's evidence, that he was of the understanding that permission from National Treasury had to actually be given before advance payments could be made. That was at least his view. No framework here. Permission.
No. I think let's clarify that. In circumstances like this, for example, which clearly will fall outside the framework, you will then have to go to National Treasury or Treasury, so that you can also outline how we are going to manage, because the issue here is not to lose money, how you are going to implement this particular scheme, if I may call it that way. But there is a standard framework that says, yes, prepayments are allowed, advance payments are allowed, provided they are part of a contract. But clearly, this is an exception here. What we're dealing with here is an exception. It will require outside permission from Treasury. You know, it's not like me and you, one contractor, advance payments or prepayments, and I simply apply that particular framework, and then we agree on specific milestone. For example, it's a small contractor. He's not able to execute because he's an SMME and so on. In that instance, you do that particular advance payment, but it's part of the contract, which might also include that the department must co-sign with you on a bank account, for example. You know, all those particular controls will then put in place.
I understand. If we could just summarize then. I'm sorry I interrupted you. Had you finished?
Yeah, I'm done.
The framework you talk about makes provision for advance payment provided certain conditions are met.
Correct.
The circumstances that we're dealing with in this case clearly fall outside that framework.
And the sheer magnitude of it.
And the sheer magnitude, right, fall outside that framework.
Yes.
So we can put that framework aside. In this case, it would have been necessary to get the permission of National Treasury.
Yes.
Okay, and that permission wasn't obtained.
No, it wasn't.
Okay. You say in paragraph 44.3, the national departments and the National Treasury's main objection to the payments was that they were advance payments.
I'm sorry, Mr. Pretorius. I'm sorry. Now, were there situations, practical situations, such as these, where the existing framework was not used, but National Treasury was approached for approval as to what should be done? And if so, did the National Treasury give approval for that situation, in effect saying you can work outside the framework, existing framework? Or did something like that never happen practically?
I can't recall any of those circumstances that they ever existed.
Yeah.
You know.
Yes.
Because, you know, the advance prepayments or advance payments are more of an exception rather than the rule.
Yes.
The rule is, you know, you pay, work gets done, and you pay. You know? Yes. Or in certain instances where there might be some sort of a premium, particularly in big contracts, in huge contracts, you know, what they call site establishment. Site establishment, it's a sort of a prepayment, if you look at it, but it will have been contracted upfront to say, to have the contractor to set up site. You know, he need money because they have not started working as it. So it will be a certain percentage, 10% of the value of the contract, and that's. But it's within the framework to say it must be contracted to, it must be a part of it, but not at the scale that we are talking about.
But apart from the question whether at a practical level you know of any situations which arose, in terms of instruments, regulations, is there a provision that says if you can't work or if you don't work within this framework, existing framework, you can approach National Treasury outside of that framework for something, for approval to be given outside of that framework?
Well, No, not that I'm
Or is it
aware.
something
Not
just-
that I'm aware of. Remember, Treasury is the custodians of the financial rules and regulations.
Yes, yes, yes.
Now, where there is uncertainty around a particular issue, you'll
Yes.
always go to them
Yes,
and solicit
Yes.
their view and request their support or approval and so on.
yes,
That's normally what you will do, particularly if you are not certain.
yes. So when you say approval could have been, or the National Treasury could have been approached for approval, if I understood you correctly, you're not basing that on any specific provision in any regulation.
No.
You just think that because they are the custodians of these regulations, if you have difficulty working within the existing framework, you might have to approach them. What they will say to you is something you don't know. They might say, hard luck if you can't work within
you
the
can't work,
existing framework,
yes.
or they might devise something for you. You don't know whether they would be able to.
Yes, they
Yeah.
might come up with a better solution as
Yes.
to how to approach this particular,
Yeah,
So you never know, because obviously they will be evaluating the risk in terms of what you want to do.
okay, all right. Thank you, Mr.
DCJ, this is a matter of law and regulation. We'll provide you with chapter and verse.
Okay, all
There's
right.
also a judgment of His Lordship, Mr. Justice Plaskett, dealing with these,
Yes, okay, all right.
which we will also provide. Paragraph 44.3 on page 110, Mr. Mackenzie, reads, the National Department's and National Treasury's main objection to the payments was that they were advance payments. Monies were being transferred to contractors or suppliers without any work having been done or materials having been received. That was their complaint, as I understand it.
Yes.
Yes. And then you say, and in fairness to yourself, you explain it a little more thoroughly here. You say in paragraph 44.4, one of the basic features of the state's policy on state-funded housing schemes, and this is reflected in various regulatory instruments, is that payment may only be made against value actually received and only on the achievement of set milestones. You've told the Chair about that.
Yes.
In other words, the state as employer will only pay a contractor for a construction job once the job has actually been completed. Interim progress payments are permissible, but only for predetermined, defined sections of the job, and then only once those sections of the job have actually been completed. The department's payments to suppliers and contractors breached these basic requirements because the suppliers had not supplied any materials and the contractors had not done any work. That is the summary of the situation there, correct?
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes, correct.
But of course the money has now been spent. And it may seem obvious, but it's perhaps worth emphasizing the whole purpose of these controls and provisions is to ensure that the people who need the money and the services provided by the money get those services properly paid for and fairly spent. Correct?
Correct.
Let's look at this expenditure recovery plan, if you will. If you could go, please, to page 226 of FS 14. Now, to make clear the context, once again, of this plan, this is now in October 2010. Half the year has already gone, and this is an expenditure recovery plan to take place in the remaining 6 months of the year. October, November, December, January, February, March. If this is the plan at page 226 of bundle FS 14. Do you see that? Do you recognize this
Yes, I can.
document?
Yes, I see it.
All right, it contains various provisions. It's actually a slide presentation. But if I could ask you please to go to page 229. I'm sorry, it's page, I'm confusing myself with red and black numbers, Chair, my apologies. Go to page black number 232.
Okay. Yes.
It's actually over the page that I wanted you to go, but in fact I wasn't confused. Please go back to page 229. Ten-point plan on expenditure recovery plan continued. Are you at page 229?
Yes.
The plan says that projects must be classified into two groups. Group A, ready to run. Focus on all projects that are ready to run, it should read. 50 projects with 4,844 housing units. Focused approach on casting of foundations, wall plates, and finals. That would include the roof, I presume.
Yeah.
Correct?
Yes.
In other words, what this plan was saying to National Treasury and the National Department is we're going to actually build the houses.
Correct.
Yes. And if one goes to, well, at least 4,800 of them, if one goes to page 233, one sees the cash flow projections.
The 233.
Yes. In other words, what the Free State Department is saying to National Treasury and to the National Department, in order to, quote, recover the expenditure, unquote, in other words, to avoid the loss of the expenditure, is that this is our cash flow projection. This is what we're going to spend in the various months remaining this year. I understand that document correctly, do I?
Yes. To say
So-
up to the end of the financial year, this is how.
Yes. So
Yes.
it says November 2010, and then there are various items of expenditure under that heading, correct?
Yeah.
Totaling 256 million rand.
November.
I've rounded the figure.
Oh,
Look at the
okay.
total at the bottom,
Okay.
correct? In other words, what the department was telling National Treasury and the National Department was that in November 2010, we would do 8,500 foundations. We would expend 170 million rand. Wall plates on the foundations, walls, 3,500. And then another expenditure figure of 86,593,500. So there would be 8,500 foundations, 170 million, 3,500 wall plates, 86.5 million. You see that?
Yes.
And so it goes on. In December 2010, the cash flow projection estimated an expenditure, if you look at the total of the bottom, of 201 million rand. Correct?
Where are you?
Are you with me? Look
No.
at December 2010,
Or December 2010.
that column.
Yeah.
2,500 foundations, 50 million would be spent.
Yes. Yes.
Wall plates, 3,500, 86.5 million rand would be spent.
Yeah.
There would be 3,000 completions, and the expenditure there in relation to those completions would be 65 million rand. But the total would be 201 million rand spent.
Yes.
January 2011, the various components would result in a total expenditure of 149,759,500 rand. You see that?
Yes.
February 2011, it was projected that 220 million rand would be spent on the various components listed in the cash flow projection schedule. Correct?
Yes.
March, 170 million, 4,300 rand. And the total, in the figure in the bottom right-hand corner, for all that work for the remaining 6 months would be an expenditure on work actually completed of 1 billion rand, 38,230,900. Correct?
Yes.
So this is the expenditure recovery plan that the national minister says to the department, give me information as to how you're going to spend the money by the end of the year in order to persuade me not to forfeit the money or not to cause you to forfeit the money to the Free State Department. This is the representation or the answer it gets. It says by the end of the financial year, we would have spent 1 billion rand. Correct?
Yes.
Now, it must have been obvious to the Free State Department at the time that this could never be achieved. You would agree?
Yeah.
In fact, this is a complete misrepresentation of the position because at the time, there was a parallel project of advanced payments being made. Correct?
Yes.
So can you give any explanation other than this is a complete fraud on the National Department? It's a difficult question for you to answer. I know you account to people, but there can be no other explanation, surely.
Yeah. So
you agree with
it's not practically possible to have spent that amount of money.
When they prepared this document, this would have been in which month of 2010? October?
Yeah, it would have been October.
I think your affidavit may be saying October.
Say for the rest of the financial year.
Do you recall, are you able to say roughly how many houses or units they had been able to build from the beginning of the financial year to October?
So at that time it was even very difficult to reconcile because of this particular problem.
But as you sit there now, did you get to conclude how many houses they had practically built and completed?
I will have to, I can't say it off the cuff. There would have been.
Yes. But
some houses.
It's a figure you can find out.
Yeah. There would have been, because you can extract that information from the HSSC system.
Yes.
There would have been perhaps a few houses and work in progress in a form of milestones, foundations, so many, and so on. There would have been.
Yes.
But
the reason why I was asking is that one might be able to say they themselves would have known that if from April, May, June, July, August, September, October, if in 7 months they'd either not built any houses or they'd built houses that fall below a certain number, there was no way they could build so many houses within the time that was left in the financial year, and given certain practicalities that they knew.
Yeah, I'm normally, on a yearly basis, there will be some of houses that have not been completed, that are only completed in the current financial year.
Yes.
You know, that move.
Yes.
Where at the end of the year you'll have so many units and a certain portion will be work in progress, so many foundation and so on, and so many wall plates, but not completions. And then you move this, we will move with that in the
To the new financial year.
in the new financial year.
Yes. But
And-
of
and-
course, in that situation, do you use the money of the new financial year to complete those, or do you
Well, it's
you
a,
carry
it's a,
over
it's a, it's
some
a,
money?
remember the expenditure framework is 3 years. So you have to look at the 3-year
Yeah.
period
Cycle,
to
yeah.
say, you know, on this particular financial year, I'll probably end up, you know, you'll have the targets
Yeah.
to say 3,000 targets. You look at the budget, yes, but it's units and sites as well. And then units, it's across all programs, you know, not necessarily RDPs, but it might also be affordable rental accommodation. So units and sites, and that's basically how it will go. And then, you know, in this particular, you can have instances where some of the projects flow into the current financial year, and you also, and that's why there will be rollovers that are approved, because you have existing projects that are running that you can show to say, I request a rollover. I did not spend, but here are my commitments. And then National Treasury will then approve and say, right, we have existing contracts that are running. Now, your budget in that particular year will have been, let's say it will have been 100,000. But because of the approval of the rollover, maybe of 200,000, the budget for that party becomes 1,200. The rollover plus the budget for the current year. So it moves on like that.
But if I recall your evidence earlier correctly, you said that as at October 2010, the National Department was saying that, or had determined that the Free State Department had not exceeded 10% of expenditure in the funds that had been allocated. Is that correct?
Yes, the report was saying,
Yeah.
you know, the monitoring report was saying you have only spent 10%
Yes.
of
the allocation. So,
Right.
so now, what it means now, when you look at this document at page 233 that Mr. Pretorius was dealing with, is that I mean, the 10% of 1 billion would have been about 100 million, more or
Possibly.
less, yeah.
Possibly.
So they, effectively, they were saying, even though in 6-7 months, we were only able to use 10%, in the balance of the months of the financial year, namely November, December, January, February, March, that's 5 months. And we know that there are holidays during December, and the construction industry normally doesn't work for some of that period. They were saying during those 4 or 5 months, they were going to spend 90% of the allocation.
It seems
That's what they were saying.
that's what the recovery
Something
plan
that would
was
have been quite remarkable.
was attempting to say.
Yes, okay.
The provisions of the Division of Revenue Act do, I understand, also deal with the 3-year medium-term expenditure framework. But for the purposes of this matter, it was saying that in the financial year ending, the single financial year ending March 2011, unless the allocation of 1.4 billion was spent, all or part of it would be forfeited. Am I correct?
Repeat that again, Mr. President.
In other words, you mentioned a 3-year medium-term expenditure
Yes.
framework provision that is provided for in DORA, as I understand
Yes.
my recollection of DORA. But what we were dealing with here is a single financial year,
Yes, it's a single financial year.
ending March 2011.
Yes.
And what the National Treasury was saying, unless you spend your allocation of 1.4 billion in that year, you're going to lose all or some of it.
Unless you spend and you can demonstrate by contracts, existing contracts that
Yes.
there are commitments for this money. It doesn't mean that you'll be able to spend it. And that will also allow you to get an approval for a rollover, because those projects are going to be running into the new financial year, so that you don't use the money allocated for the subsequent financial year with the projects that come from the previous financial year.
Now, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, I understand. And in fact, part of your 1.4 billion, or part of the department's 1.4 billion, was in fact a rollover from the previous year, the 2009-2010 financial year. But that's a detail that maybe is in other information. But the point is that the department wasn't saying, look, we have contracts in place and we want to roll over. What it was saying, as is now clear, and you fairly conceded, Mr. McKessie, is that we're going to spend over R1 billion in the 5 remaining months of the year from November to March. And this is how we're going to spend it, in all the details set out on page 233.
30. Okay.
And you fairly stated that it would have been impossible to achieve that, correct? Yes.
Well, is it correct that here in this document, they just state maybe what can be referred to as their targets, or maybe their plans, but I don't know whether it can be called plans, because unless you draw my attention to something that I haven't picked up, it doesn't look like they show in this document how they will achieve these targets within the time frame that was that they had.
Yeah, that, for example, if you say 3,500 wall plates, I'm just making.
Please raise your voice.
If you say 3,500 wall plates, for example,
Yes.
where are they?
Yes.
Right, because it means there must be 3,500 foundations somewhere.
Yes.
Right.
And there must be contractors with
On
whom
site.
you already have, who are on site,
Who are working?
who are already working,
Yes.
and there must have been an assessment of what they are capable of doing within what time. That has enabled you to say, by a certain time, they will have reached they will have done the walls.
Because you can't have wall plates without foundations.
Of course, yeah. Yes.
And you must also be in the position to pinpoint it is in Belfontein, in wherever, all these other areas, to say these are the 3,500
Yes.
wall
Now,
plates.
when you look at this document and you know what you know now about what the position was, namely what houses had been built, what houses had not been built, to what extent are you able to say that this document was really a misrepresentation? Because there's no way you could talk about walls when there are no foundations.
Yeah, it was, I'll call it, I don't know whether it is a wish list, I don't know, for lack of a better term, but it would have been highly unlikely that
Yes.
the National Treasurer, the parent department,
Yeah.
Human Settlement, will approve without knowing exactly, because you have to provide details about where those houses or where those foundations are, because we are talking about the wall plates. So you'll have to say they are in this particular area. And this is how, when we talk about the recovery plan, you have to demonstrate that. If that information is lacking, there's no way that it could be approved.
Yes,
and also
but
on the face of it, it's improbable.
Yes, but I'm asking a different question. You are the HOD. You were the HOD who prepared the affidavit that we were dealing with. Now, to the extent that this document was a representation to the national department that the provincial department would achieve these targets by the end of the financial year, namely in March 2011. Are you able to say there was enough progress that had been made by October in terms of the building of the houses and the foundations and everything for them to have been able to achieve this? Are you able to say?
If you think about the 10%,
Yes.
that has been said, this is where you were
Yeah.
in terms of expenditure. Surely they were not enough.
Yes.
Whether foundation or wall plates,
Yes.
or whatever the situation might be at the
Yes.
time, to be able to achieve this.
But also, as at that time, based on what you know, what you got to know when you became HOD, are you not able to say there were not enough contractors, for example, who were qualified, who could have done such a job within such a short space of time? Is that something you are not able to say based on the reports you subsequently got when you became HOD?
Well, I'm not able to, I can only infer,
Yeah.
to say, in order to pull this,
Yeah.
you will need contractors also, because it's also about capacity to be able to pull. 3,500 also require a certain level of capacity and financial capital, financial capital.
But
So, and given the contractors that we know or we have in the sector, we are small contractors.
well, it would be good if this information is not already in the files here. It would be good if we can get information that tells me factually whether the progress that had been made in terms of the building of houses at the time this plan was made, October 2010, what progress had been made, and whether by writing the targets that they were putting up here, it can't be said simply on that it was clear misrepresentation. So if that's not information that's available, I would appreciate it if you could work on getting that kind of information for us. But it ought to be possible, because we're in 2020 now. We're talking about something that happened in 2010. At some stage in the years that followed, somebody ought to have said, let us see what was the position at that time. But on the information that must be available within the department, it may be able to reach some conclusion as to how much progress had been made. Based on that, was this not a clear misrepresentation? Yes, Mr. President.
Yes. But just to take a step back, I think you have fairly conceded that based on what you knew, it would not have been possible to achieve these projections.
Yes,
in the
unless
5
if you are able to say 3,500 wall plates, there they are, or foundation, sorry, foundation, there they are. You know. But where were they?
Well, your evidence is on record, but there's another way to approach it. Because at this very time, the department was devising a prepayment scheme which resulted in the expenditure of 600 million rand. Completely different parallel scheme. So at the time it's saying to National, we're going to spend this amount of money on this amount of foundations, this amount of wall plates, this amount of completions for each month from November 2010 to March 2011, and we're going to spend over R1 billion on this. At that very time, it is planning the expenditure of 600 million rand by way of prepayments to contractors and suppliers. Correct?
Yes.
The two can't sit together. We know that the prepayments of 600 million rand happened as a matter of fact. And if that was being implemented at this time, nobody could have believed in the truth of that diagram. Am I correct in that approach?
Yes.
You don't seem very categorical on some of the matters, Mr. Mutsegi, where I would expect you to be quite categorical.
In what way?
You seem quite very guarded in terms of some of the answers. Whereas
No,
I
agree. I said yes.
Yes. But it looks like there is a lot that maybe you might need to refresh your memory on, or what? For example,
No,
I would expect.
I think what should be appreciated as well, Chairperson, is remember it's and some of what is being said here is possibly hearsay, because I was not there, but as accounting officer, you also account for things that happened before you came. I think I acknowledge that. But also, that the department lost money, it's a fact. And this, which I drew up, or this affidavit, was amongst others mainly targeted at us trying to recover the money, firstly, and secondly, it's an affidavit that has been where I can't say I have a first-hand experience or a first-hand information in terms of what happened. It's because of all the documents that one collected over time and try to draw up this affidavit.
Well, going back to this, Mr. Pretorius is coming from another angle to look at this document, to say nobody could have believed this information.
I agree.
Yes. Now, but surely you do have somewhere in the department information as to how many houses had been built by end of that financial year, namely end of March 2011. Even if you might not remember it now.
I might not remember it now,
But you have got it somewhere.
The source of that particular information, as I've indicated, will be the HSS.
Yes. Well, I would like that, because here is what was projected. What I would like is, if possible, by October, when this document was prepared, this was the state of affairs about this project.
Yeah, I think we'll try and
You'll try and do that, yeah.
and go back.
Yes.
Look also at. We'll also have to go and source documents, like, because ordinarily there would be reports.
Yes.
The DORA reports on a monthly
Yeah.
basis that indicate where the targets are.
Yeah.
Where, how much, and so on.
Yeah.
There will be those particular reports that we'll compare.
I
And
mean,
then we'll have to go back.
Even
to
if we are not
2010, 11.
able to say even accurate number, of units that had been built by October 2010, but a reasonable estimate might do. But from the mere fact that they'd spent 10%, about 100 million rand, that ought on its own to give us an idea that maybe on the base of 100 million rand or so, X number of units would have been completed. Can't be more, could not have been more. But out of whatever units they may have, they may have been working on, some of them might not have been complete. Maybe none of them would have been complete, but it could not have been more than X number, simply from the money, the amount of money that had been spent out of the 1 billion rand. And then you look at what was the state of affairs as at the end of the financial year. How many units had been completed, how many units were not completed. And in that way, one could come back to this and be able to say, whoever was drawing this document, if they knew exactly what we're talking about, they knew they were misrepresenting the position in a very serious way. Okay. Mr. Pretorius.
Thank you. Just to complete the point that I was raising with you, Mr. Mkhize, we know that during or about October 2010, the Free State Department of Human Settlements was still contemplating spending 600 million rand on materials, let alone completed work. Correct?
Yes.
So I think the conclusions you've reached were, at the very least, not unfair or unreasonable conclusions. Let's move to another topic. And that was, what were the communications from the National Department of Human Settlements to the Provincial Department of Human Settlements? On the 29th of October 2010, there was what is called a Technical Human Settlements MINMEC meeting. Now, there is MINMEC and there is Technical MINMEC. Could you explain to the Chair what they are? Please.
Technical MINMEC it's technocrats, officials, and it's chaired by the DG. And all the relevant officials will be there, primarily all the HODs and the CFOs, and perhaps the certain support staff. That will be the technical MINMEC. The MINMEC is a minister and MECs. So the technical MINMEC then feeds into MINMEC for approval of whatever decision, whether it's policy issues and so on. So that's in short what it is.
Right. If you go to paragraph 44.5, what you say there is that at a technical MINMEC of human settlements held on the 29th of October 2010.
Paragraph 44.
Sorry.
You are
Paragraph
page,
44.5
I'm still on the ERP.
on page 110. I'm sorry.
Paragraph
Let's go back to page 110
110.
of your affidavit.
110.
Yes, Chair. Paragraph 44.5.
Yes. Paragraph 44.5, yes.
5, yes. There reference is made to a technical MINMEC, that's M-I-N capital M-E-C, meeting held on the 29th of October 2010. That would have been various officials from the National Department and various officials from the Provincial Department of Human Settlements, correct?
Yes, yes.
And you say at that meeting, Mr. Cheney, on behalf of the National Department, and Mr. Matlachwa, on behalf of the provincial department, were present, and that Mr. Cheney made it clear that payments were unlawful and impermissible. Do you see that?
Yes.
What payments were being referred to there?
I would, it could only have been the advance payments.
Advance payments. All right. Now,
For the purchase of material.
yes, you say in paragraph 44.6, you've relied for the account above on the evidence given by Cheney at the disciplinary hearing on 20 June 2013, and you give reference to the transcription of that evidence. We've looked at that evidence, and to be fair to you, Mr. Cheney is not entirely clear of when information reached the National Department in regard to the payments and the status of those payments. He talks about various meetings. There was an October meeting, there was a November meeting, there was a meeting at Velcom. Do you recall the Velcom meeting? But he's not entirely clear of precisely when National became aware of the irregularities. And it also was debated in the disciplinary hearing of what the National Department learned. On the one hand, it was put to Mr. Cheney that what the National Department learned from its Chief Financial Officer, who had perused the housing subsidy scheme records, that payments were being made directly to suppliers, and that the complaint at that stage at least was that payments to suppliers is not a good idea. In fact, it's improper because there are no controls. You're simply paying to suppliers and the suppliers can overcharge. They don't have, that system wouldn't have the control in the contract with a contractor who must receive, verify, put on site and the like. On the other hand, it may have been, and it's not clear from Cheney's evidence, that the nub of the complaint was the advance payments. But as far as you're concerned, the complaint was advance payments. Is that correct?
Yes, yes, advance payments. That's what we are dealing with.
All right. If necessary, we'll deal with that in submissions, Chair, or in. But I think it would not be fair to tax Mr. Mkesi on that issue. It lies within the mouths of others. So Mr. Cheney refers to various meetings. He was ill for a long time. He talks about an October meeting, a November meeting, and a meeting the following year. He talks about the risks involved in paying suppliers directly without going through the contractors, and he also talked, I think, about advance payments. But the sequence and the detail is elusive on his evidence, so let's leave that there. Okay? Your evidence, as I understand it, is that National complained that the plans of the province were unlawful and impermissible because they were advance payments. Correct?
Yes.
Yes. All right. Then Mr. Matlachwa also gave evidence of events around this time. If I can give you the reference, Chair, it's bundle FS 17 at page 259. What he said is that he conveyed this warning that he'd received to the head of department, Mr. Mokoena. And Mr. Mokoena, and later the MEC said, you proceed nevertheless. Do you know anything about that?
No, I've seen it on the evidence of Mr. MacArthur. That's what I don't know anything about it.
You don't deal with it here?
Yeah.
We'll deal with that Through other evidence, Chair. So the October meeting of MINMEC Technical, you deal with at paragraph 44.5, but there are no minutes attached. Do you see that? You don't attach any minutes of that meeting when you deal with paragraph 44.5 and 44.6. You merely refer to Cheney's testimony. Correct?
For the technical and the main minutes.
Paragraph 44.5?
Yeah.
You refer to the Technical Human Settlements MINMEC meeting of 29 October 2010. Correct?
Yes.
And over the page you say what happened at that meeting. And in paragraph 44.6 you say, in saying that, what you say in paragraph 44.5, you rely on Mr. Cheney's testimony transcribed in the record of the disciplinary hearing.
Yes. Okay.
Correct.
Yeah.
There was another meeting, however, that took place on the 18th of November, another technical MINMEC meeting, and you deal with that at paragraph 54. Well, you deal with it at paragraph 50. You say in the second sentence, or you say in paragraph 50, I referred earlier to the Technical Human Settlements MINMEC meeting held on 29 October, at which Cheney advised Makatwa that the department's advance payments were unlawful.
Which paragraph, Mr. Petro?
50 on
50.
page 112.
Okay.
Then you say a follow-up Technical Human Settlements MINMEC meeting was held on 18 November 2010. You see that? And then you do attach a copy. And there you say, in paragraph 52, again, Makatwa attended on behalf of the department. He presented the department's expenditure recovery plan. So it seems that that plan was actually presented at an official meeting, according to this record.
Yes.
Correct?
Yes.
He also, that's in addition to presenting the plan, raised the proposed use of tripartite agreements in the housing project. Those are the agreements, remember, between the department, the supplier, and the contractors.
Yes.
Correct. That second level of agreement. Not the session agreements, but the middle level of agreement. And you say in paragraph 53, the technical MINMEC meeting rejected the department's expenditure recovery plan. It warned the department not to implement it. Over the page you say, paragraph 54, there were two major problems. First, the plan did not demonstrate the department's ability to spend its allocation in the few months remaining until the end of the financial year, 30 March 2011. Second, the proposed tripartite agreements were rejected since suppliers would have to supply materials in bulk without the necessary support to ensure quality and proper procurement proceedings. Also, there are a lot of risks with this arrangement. You see that? There were two issues discussed,
Yes.
as you say. But what is clear that at least at that stage, the department was not persuaded that the allocation could be spent. You referred to that earlier in your evidence. You recall that?
Yes.
Second, however, the proposed tripartite agreements were rejected. So it seems there were two issues on the table. The one is the expenditure recovery plan, which we've referred to, particularly that cash flow projection. And secondly, another way of spending money, which would be to pay suppliers direct. That was also rejected.
Yes.
Okay. Then it seems from paragraph 46 that another meeting was held on the 19th of November, that's the next day.
Paragraph 46.
Para 56.
Or 56.
On page 113. A human settlements MINMEC meeting. held on 19 November 2010. Again, Mr. Makatwa attended on behalf of the department. You see that?
Yes.
Now that is with the national minister and the provincial MECs of human settlements, as I understand
correct.
your evidence, correct? Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Paragraph 58, the MINMEC meeting, that's the one on the 19th of November, confirmed the approach adopted at the technical MINMEC meeting, namely that funds would be shifted from non-performing provinces. That's the warning, correct?
Yes.
Paragraph 59, Mr. Makatwa returned to Bloemfontein and advised the then head of department, Paul Mokoena, that the department had been warned not to implement the expenditure recovery plan. However, Mokoena instructed Makatwa to proceed with the plan. I base this allegation on the findings of the disciplinary hearing, where this evidence is thoroughly dealt with and in detail. But your conclusion, I might say, accurately reflects the proceedings in the disciplinary hearing. Correct. That's where you got your information.
Yes, that's where I got it.
Right. Of course, having followed the instructions of Mr. Mokoena, Mr. Makatwa ultimately gets dismissed, but that's a story for later on in these proceedings. Paragraph 60, you say Mokwena's instruction was formalized by an internal memorandum. The memorandum was prepared by Muso Tsoametsi, who was then the Deputy Director General of the department. Mokoena signed the memorandum approving the recommendations it contained. There is some evidence to the effect that Mr. Mokoena requested Mr. Tsoametsi to prepare a legal opinion on the legality of the issue, but that document prepared by Mr. Tsoametsi is not an opinion at all. Do you know anything about that?
No.
Of course, the memorandum itself, as you point out in paragraph 62 and following, which served to implement the advance payment plan, was itself not followed, let alone it not being proper in the first place to even contemplate such a plan. The plan that was contemplated was also not followed at all. And you detail that in paragraph 62 to 64. Basically, the memorandum prepared by Mr. Tsoametsi said that the department would only pay material suppliers for material actually supplied to a contractor and invoiced, with the invoices to be backed up by a certificate issued by the contractor confirming receipt of the material. That's contained in the memorandum. But that's not what happened, am I correct?
Yes, that's not what happened.
What happened in fact?
Well, materials were either not delivered or instances, and this is what we also picked up, they were either not delivered or instances where they were delivered, they were not delivered in the quantities that are required, or some of the contractors denied that the materials were ever delivered to them. And then this is what we were faced with. To say in certain instances we had suppliers just dropping materials on site without any supervision and so on. So that's basically what happened. But in terms of the certification of the material as contemplated in the memorandum, it didn't happen. It happened only to a very lesser extent where it happened. It did happen in certain instances, but not in all instances.
You summarize that in paragraph 65 and 66 on page 115. If I may just read that and you can confirm whether it's correct or not. Paragraph 65 on page 115 reads, "The department's decisions were in clear breach of the advice given to it by the National Department via Cheney and the technical MINMEC meetings. The department had been told that its expenditure recovery plan was not acceptable and that it should not implement it. It had also been told that paying suppliers without the suppliers having supplied materials was unlawful." Is that your analysis
Yes.
of the documentation that you looked at?
Yes.
All right. We don't have a minute, I must say, of the expenditure recovery plan being rejected, but we do have a minute of suppliers' payments being warned against. But that's part of the record that we can deal with the chair in submissions. Paragraph 66 goes, "As I set out in more detail below, the department proceeded to make payments to suppliers without the suppliers having supplied material, i.e. it made payments in advance. No written agreements were concluded governing these payments. The department did not follow any proper procurement process to identify the suppliers to which it paid payments. The total value of the payments made is nearly 1 billion. Now that's in relation to the prepayment scheme. Does that reflect your researches into the materials that you referred to in paragraph 4 of your affidavit?
Yes.
Right. Before I get to the next topic, I'd like to just make one point or put one issue before you. There doesn't appear to be a minute of the national department at a technical MINMEC or even a MINMEC or any other meeting saying to the provincial department, your expenditure recovery plan cannot be implemented, it is unrealistic. We don't have a minute of that. And if, in fact, the National Department was saying, look, you can't pay suppliers directly because it's too risky, then, of course, it wouldn't be commenting on the expenditure recovery plan, it would be commenting on the other process, correct?
Can you repeat that?
Sorry, it's a long question and it's been a long day. We don't have a minute of any meeting where national says to provincial, don't implement the expenditure recovery plan. We don't have a minute of a rejection of the expenditure recovery plan. One can, of course, argue that had they looked at it, they would have obviously come to the same conclusion, or that they actually did reject it, as you say.
Yeah, one can only infer, because here's that ERP was prepared. It must have been prepared, and the way we know the process is that the recovery plan, you present it to the technical meeting. Either it will have been presented to these performance reviews, which are not necessarily technical MINMEC per se, or they will also be presented in the technical MINMEC where it will be approved or rejected. There should have been a process that decides that we are taking money from you to that province or provinces.
That's what happened, in fact.
I mean, and it happened.
Yes.
So, there must have been some sort of an engagement
Yes,
and
sure.
some sort of a correspondence.
One can infer, too, that if they had asked for it, if the minister had said, give me an expenditure recovery plan, they would have looked at it, and I would imagine, and I think it's reasonable to put to you, would not have been convinced by it, as you say.
Yes, they would have been.
They would not have been convinced by it.
Yes.
Yes. Because clearly on the face of it, it was not an achievable project. But you've given that evidence, I don't want to repeat it. We might get into another round of exchanges. But the second point I wanted to make arising out of that is that a rejection of the idea that suppliers should be paid directly and not via contractors is another matter. It's a separate matter.
Okay.
Correct.
Okay, yes.
Yes. All right. Well, we needn't take that much further than that. If I could take you to paragraph 72, that refers to certain press statements. And if you go back to paragraph 69, you record there that on the 18th of January 2011, the National Department issued a media statement.
Yes.
Saying that it was shifting funding from underperforming provinces, the Free State and KwaZulu-Natal, to other provinces. Correct.
Correct.
And the response of the department to that was to say, no, we're going to spend everything by the end of the financial year. By the end of January, in its response press statement, the Free State says, according to paragraph 70, by the end of January 2011, expenditure should be around 85%. Now, if one includes the 600 million plus spent on advance payments, that might or might not be correct. We don't know that.
We don't know that.
But you do say in paragraph 72, by the time these statements, these press statements were issued, the department had already transferred several hundred million rand from its conditional allocation to suppliers, and I stress suppliers, and that would have been for materials.
Materials, yes.
It continued to make unlawful transfers in January, February, and March 2011. The transfers were made without the suppliers having supplied material, without written agreements in respect of or regulating the transfers, and without any procurement process having been followed. Correct?
Yes. Correct.
You agree with that
Yes.
statement?
Yes.
And then paragraph 73, the department made the transfers for the purpose of avoiding having its conditional allocation stopped and transferred to better performing provinces. That was the object.
Yes.
It made the transfers so that it looked as if the conditional allocation had been spent. I submit that this was a fraud on the National Treasury and on the national government more broadly, as well as on the taxpayers and the public generally. That's a repeat of your earlier statements regarding the fraud. Correct?
Correct.
I repeat that the unlawful transfers, you say in paragraph 74, amounted to plus minus 631 million rand in total. That deals with that section. You deal with the material supply agreements in paragraphs 87 and 88 of your statement. That's on page 124. You see that?
Yes.
That's between October 2010 and August 2011, the department concluded approximately 112 agreements termed material supply agreements. These were the tripartite agreements of which we've spoken earlier.
Yes.
They're well summarized in the judgment of Paul AJ, which we may refer to because they're a convenient summary, but we could do that at a later stage, perhaps by way of revision tomorrow morning. But what is instructive about that statement is that at the very time the expenditure recovery plan was being devised and presented to National, that's October 2010, this parallel scheme of material supply agreements to spend 600 million rand was being devised. Correct?
Yes.
You then deal with, in the following paragraphs, the material supply agreements. And you highlight certain provisions of the tripartite agreement. Firstly, there's the conflict between the contractor's obligation to source materials and pay for materials and the department doing so directly with the supplier. You recall that conflict?
Yeah, the material supply and the contract. Yes.
The contractors with the contract.
Yeah, because
Yes.
the material supply was put the responsibility of acquiring material was now put on the
Now
on
it
the- on
was
the
clear.
department.
Right. The agreement, you say in 90.2, obliges the contractor to order its building material from the material supplier. But now in the tripartite agreement, there's a possibility of a direct link between the department and the
material
supplier.
supplies.
Correct.
Yes.
But what is interesting about this tripartite agreement in paragraph 90.3, which you point out, there are no fixed prices. So in other words, the supply agreement is entered into with the hope, as you put it, that the material would be supplied at the best price. So one enters into a contract with no price being fixed, and the material supplier is told, just give us your best price. You make the remark later about whether this is a commercially viable way of going about business. What is your remark about that?
Well, there's an element of risk, particularly for the contractor, because all the milestones prices, foundation, wall place, those prices are fixed. Now, if you don't manage, because the biggest input in building of houses is material. It constitutes perhaps 80 or 90% of the input costs. Now, if you don't manage that particular issue and will simply leave it to the material supplier, you run the risk of material suppliers either overcharging, and unfortunately, because the price is fixed, the contractor possibly, because we pay a fixed price, 100. If we say foundation is 10,000, that's what it is. That's what we are going to pay. So you can end up actually, if you do not manage that material part of it, the contractor can end up actually spending 12,000 for argument's sake, and we are certainly are not going to pay 12,000. We are going to pay 10,000, and that it will obviously, what's going to happen is the contractor will abandon site because he is obviously losing money. So that's the risk, basically.
In summary, Ms. Mkhetsi, at page 125 and page 126, you deal with the terms of the tripartite agreement for the supply of materials, the agreement which provided for direct payment at no fixed price, as you point out, by the department to the supplier as opposed to the contractor. And you point out on page 127 how these tripartite agreements varied the contracts with the contractor. To give the simplest example, the contractor was originally obliged to source materials and pay for them, and would only be paid by the department once they were the building milestone had been completed. This provided for an upfront payment directly to the supplier without the controls that you've referred to and creating the risks that you referred to. All that is detailed here. I don't think it's necessary to go to it in any detail. It's clear what you say here. and that's backed up by an examination of the contract and by the findings of Advocate van Graan in the disciplinary inquiry. You make the point in paragraph 95, in addition on page 128, that this material supply agreement is most unusual in the construction industry, and it is at odds with the requirements of the housing subsidy scheme. Correct?
Yes.
You see that in paragraph 95. Again, we don't need to go into detail, except perhaps to say in paragraph 95.2, what you say is that there's a departure from the requirement that materials actually be incorporated into the houses being built into the satisfaction of the employer before the employer is required to pay for the materials. That's the department. The department would ordinarily, in proper expenditure process and in accordance with all the regulations and the regulatory framework, have to be satisfied that the materials are actually there in the completed house before it pays for them. Correct?
Yes.
And you also make the remark at the bottom of paragraph 96 on page 129. The department paid substantial amounts of money, often with no invoice at all.
Page
129, the last 3 lines of the first paragraph on the page, paragraph 96. The department paid substantial amounts of money, often with no invoice at all. Where there was a document purporting to be an invoice, it was not certified and was often patently false. You've given that evidence.
Yes.
And those examples would appear in the reports. Then, at the bottom of page 129, you deal with the session agreements, and if we're going to complete the summary, we should deal with those. But before that, Chair, I would want to deal, and I see we're beyond the time now. I'd like to deal with another topic, which I'd like to deal with tomorrow also. Would this be a convenient time?
I wanted to find out whether, in terms of how much time we will need during the week, whether we need to go beyond 4 o'clock or whether we should stop at 4 o'clock because we'll be able to manage.
Well, I was hoping to finish the evidence well in time.
Well in time?
Yes.
Okay. Then in that event, let's adjourn then, and then we'll continue tomorrow. Okay. We'll adjourn, and then tomorrow we'll start at 10 o'clock. We adjourn.
All right.
The only thing that concerns me is the last paragraph of both Matata and Savoy, where they say they continue. I don't know if they continue. He doesn't know if they continue. As long as someone says that he did it. Our only concern. You've never seen me so quiet, Paul. You've never seen me so quiet.
We must give you more COVID pills.
Yeah.